Welcome to this week's episode of the Struggle Cast, and we're going to talk a little bit about the New Deal. And for anybody that's listened so far, you're probably sick to death of that. We're going to get past that. We've got one more episode to go after this on the New Deal that I've promised about the CCC and how fundamental and wonderful I think that was. A successful program for this country. Today, though, we're going to talk about another New Deal program that just fascinates me, especially some mirrors to our time right now. And then, you had literary greats come from this, and not just on the creative narrative end, but you had some just, let's say, literary greats, especially coming up. Anyway, we'll get to that in just a second. And it was a part of the WPA, and it was a program. Excuse me, I keep clicking my lips. I've got to stop doing that. All right. So here we go. The part of the program was, usually most people associate the New Deal and workers. Really, I think it's mostly associated with, actual laborers. You think about the construction workers, and the on the architectural side, the engineering side, and these big work programs. And we forget that as today, and we'll get to the parallels. A year or so ago, we'll see how long ago was it. I think it was in the end of 2020 or end of 2021. I forget which. A new bill was introduced into Congress. Now, it didn't go anywhere, obviously, but wanted and cited this particular program as a wonderful way to maybe give some relief during the horrible times of 2020 through 2022. I don't have to say it. Anyway, so it was the Writers Program, and what it's the Federal Writers Project was a part of the WPA, and not everybody works in labor, building, manufacturing, construction, etc. There were still men and women that needed to be employed. They were on the creative end of things, kind of like today. Oh, and by the way, you'll have to forgive Stubbs. He's with us again, napping. It's just easier. So sorry for being folksy and breaking in there for a minute. And for those of you listening only on audio, very sleepy old terrier behind me. Anyway, so the creatives, much like today, needed employment too. So the Federal Writers Project literally went, and it had a hierarchy to where the federal administrative program and every state had their own little offices, and creatives, generally out-of-work writers, journalists, and lots of others, because there was administrative staff and et cetera that obviously had to be there to help internal. And much like today, there was a lot of pushback from different political ideologies that saw this as a waste, and really saw all of the New Deal as a threat. But context, again, we are coming off the Depression and, the acknowledgement of labor, a gilded age that had left them in ruin. So there's a lot of, almost existential questioning already going on in society and politically at that time. I hope I didn't mess up the shot. So this Federal Writers Project, seemed to put creatives back, and wonderful things came out of this. Some of the most notable things right off the top of my head are they got contemporaneous folk narratives, which, much like that could be done today, and I think that was the premise of the bill, is being, we still have people that are around and could speak of the civil rights struggle or so many historical events. And as someone that really loves history, nothing is better actually than the eyewitness parts of history, which are rarely taught in any massive way, and left to these broad strokes. Anyway, so a lot of pushback on the program, but in essence, the program got going. So there were people dispatched over all states. And so the first things that came out, and I guess what they're probably most known for and the most prominent parts of the program were the state guides. And each state had a guide, and it was a collection, and usually they were set up in these 3 segments. The first segment, if I'm not mistaken, is about it was essays written contemporaneously about what it's like to live in a place and what the feelings were. And now we don't find this remarkable, but that type of first-person telling and almost archival accounts, that wasn't, as far as I know, it was fairly revolutionary, and only a few projects had actually been undertaken at that point in that capacity. So there were a collection of slave narratives called the Slave Narrative Collection, that are our interviews. Excuse me, I've got my notes pulled up. Sorry, you have to forgive me for having to look at notes. And, this would be a good point to go ahead and put on my spiffy glasses, and because I'm pretending to be a professional, let's just pretend that you don't see lights occasionally flash in my glasses. But anyone that's ever worked in production knows that it's really hard. I don't have a team of me and the old dog. But all right, so the Slave Narrative Collection is we're talking, there were over 2,300 interviews conducted and accounts given, photographs, which was absolutely priceless. Because these are things that are lost, and then somebody else gets to write the history of, and there's just really not much better than getting a first-person account. Now, this may be a fair time. When I discovered A People's History, which was a Howard Zinn book, I guess it was probably late 80s, early 90s as a young teenager, and I've always enjoyed history, and I'm not saying that was the first. That's the first where I had been taken down a path of, I didn't even think that you should probably just listen to the people that lived through the history and read their accounts versus, the beginning of vetting news, I guess, without even knowing it at the time. But, there was a folklorist named Benjamin Boykin who kept these manuscripts, and in fact, an artist, writer named Colson Whitehead won a Pulitzer for the Underground Railroad, which used quite a bit of this as research and as inspiration. And since we're going to delve into that, this might be the best time. And I'm going to be all over the place today. It's been a crazy day. That's why it's going up a little late. So forgive me. It's taken a little longer to get it up today. Had some very busy couple days, which are good, but it keeps me away from doing this, and I'm trying to. So maybe this is a good time. Like, subscribe, do all those things if you can. Download, share, tell your friends. Why not? If you can, donate. If you can't, that's cool. It's all here anyway. But this is what keeps us going. So just forgive me today for being a little late, and I'm realizing I should have taken that guitar cable down there, but it's not, my backdrop is not a prop. Those are mine. So we were back. We were talking about, and you can listen to me on any streaming service. And for those of you listening only, you can pop over to YouTube and look. And for sure, if you're on YouTube, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. You know, the algorithm for this kind of material is not really high, you know. So let's try to keep it going. And again, I'm just trying to get people interested and finding out a little bit of history, because it's so easy to apply forward today. And it seems to be a bit of a lost art, especially when it comes to context. It's hard to get context in current events right now. So believe it or not, a good way to get some context is to look in the past at similar events. And, you know, people are people. So there's a, you know, it's the same thing in sports. You know, you run the tape, right? What are the tendencies? And I'll just leave it at that. So we're going to talk about the slave narrative and what came out of that. Obviously, again, another Pulitzer Prize winning work was managed to use the archive information and the interviews there. Now, when we talk about the New Deal, here's the pushback, you know, from the modern look back, armchair quarterbacking on, generally in more libertarian right-wing circles, about failures, which is it's rich that there's usually an element of race and shaming by people that usually want to avoid those subjects with a 10-foot pole, especially as it, you know, comes to policy, especially institutional policy. But I digress. So the looking backwards, you know, some of the criticisms of the New Deal were, you know, it wasn't necessarily equitable for all. And that's true, particularly when we're talking about, you know, and I'm bringing this up due to the writers program, because there were writers and administrative workers that had to work in Jim Crow South. And while there was some documentation of that, and again, this program was, it can't be understated, it for the first time culturally and collectively, the United States held up a mirror and sent creatives to capture basically the essence of what the United States is and who the people are. You know, that really shouldn't ever be understated. Now looking back, it's a beloved, and even the writers program, which was considered a failure sort of at the time, and we'll get to that. I mean, there's reasons. You know, there's always going to be pushback, but the criticisms were generally, a lot of them were race-baited, as we talked about in the last episode about the Mat-Su Valley, and the government was fully, I mean, I'm by no means going to apologize for the United States government, especially in FDR's administration, about how things were handled and whether or not, slide the chair down a little bit, Superman curls popping out, you know, the assumption that people of Nordic descent could handle the cold better, and all these crazy ideas that primarily left out a lot of women, African Americans, and minorities of all stripes. And that's 100%. I mean, yeah, those are incredibly valid arguments. And in this particular case, working in Jim Crow South, you know, you had people that were way more qualified at running the administrations that were, you know, in clerical and administrative roles. So the only thing I can say that would even be remotely defensible of that state is, you know, just like anything, which is ironic that this whole program was holding up a mirror to the United States, we also need to hold up the mirror that even the most well-intentioned Roosevelt and FDR, you know, the Roosevelt New Deal, and they're mirrors of their time, you know, and let's just be honest. And I think that's a lot of the problem in the United States, maybe even today, is just an unwillingness to get past that first level of denial of, no, that's who we were. And, you know, it's it doesn't excuse the horrific behavior in the past, but it should point as a guidepost forward, on what we know we don't want to be. And I don't think we focus on that sometimes enough as a society. It's, again, too much. Everybody wants to own each other, and that's both sides. I'm going to shame you both on this. However, I digress. We're going to get back to this. So, again, a reflection of the times, built-in racism and horrible thinking. Now, there were net positives, particularly for the African American culture, that came directly from this. And let's just, first, I'm just going to give you, and there were hundreds of writers, some known, unknown, and, I know it's corny. I'm going to give you the greatest. I'm going to give you the names that you'll probably know of. You should probably go look at some of the others. And, you'll get closer to what's going on. So let's just get to the list of the who's here that were actually in the program and not just influenced, like I was saying about the Pulitzer Prize winning The Underground Railroad book. So now let's just get to it. And first I'm going to start off with the who's who that directly relates to African American culture, even to this day. You've got Ralph Ellison, immediately writing at the time. Richard Wright was writing, and not long after the program ended, published his first novel. It's these are important writers coming right out of it, and Margaret Walker. Let me think. I don't remember my notes. Sorry, y'all. I'm so unprofessional. Mae Swenson, Nelson Algren. We need to come back to that in fact in a minute. But Arno Wendell Bontemps, which is a poet. Again, Margaret Walker, Richard Wright, and millions of others. And we're not talking just these guys, but let me go over here back to my notes. And I'm let you in a little secret. I have a little bit of a background in journalism, and so I've always been an admirer of journalism and the literary journalism style. Saul Bellows, Richard Wright, John how did I forget John Cheever? John fucking Cheever, man, right? Ralph Ellison. I don't know how many times I gotta keep saying it. Saul Bellow. And for me, it was like, all of these writers are absolutely brilliant, and if you haven't read, you should, find it out. Anywho, Studs Terkel. And in fact, I think Studs Terkel was one of the few people that kind of defended it, and even later did some interviews. But if you don't know who Studs Terkel is, famous journalist in Chicago, World War II correspondent. The pining away, and, I try not to fall into a trap of romanticizing a past that I didn't live, especially in those times. It was horrific. But for some reason, I want to believe that the journalism was far superior. And there's reasons for that. I don't want to get really deep into that, but I will say, as somebody that's worked in the industry for a very long time, up until the very late 60s and 70s, statistically, journalists were primarily blue-collar workers, and a vast number of them didn't even have college degrees. They were journalists. And so, as a consequence, everything prior to that, the news did somewhat represent the class of people that was covering it. It turned a little bit more into a professional and aspirational profession that tries to be on par with other professions, and it became a game of access, which it still is. Let's just be clear. But if you're surrounding yourself in that game of access and political ambition, etc., you tend to cover those things because at the time those are the things that matter to you, right? And that's all. I mean, don't get me started. I don't want to get into criticism of journalism, especially, but I'm no one to judge. However, that's my own personal theory, and there are statistical numbers that back that up, at least from the financial end of it, to where when you had more blue-collar representation, you had a clearer view of what we forget is still the largest portion of the population. So maybe we should do something about that. But anyway, so those are some of the writers, and again, check them out. If you haven't read Ralph Ellison or Richard Wright, you should. And if you haven't read John Cheever, you really should. And these programs save them. Cheever was a high school dropout surviving on raisins and buttermilk, he said. So, these things are really, it was a great program that got a lot of these people and, got them out of a lot of bad circumstance. So anyway, so they produced these guidebooks that came out, and flash forward, okay, so these were the people involved and this is who it was. And it put a lot of creatives back to work. And so I guess the next important part of this story is the pushback. The program went from 35 to 43, and it was ended in 43. And a lot of people talk about the Red Scare and McCarthyism, the Committee for Un-American Activities. Only think of that as the McCarthy era, and actually the first real picket battle that went on was over these programs, particularly the writers program and the theater programs. It became a cultural war. Sound familiar? And so what happened is you had large swaths of a party that saw this as an incredible waste of American taxpayer dollars, even though we were already paying dividends. And you got to remember in context, at the time, what was happening in the United States. This is the rise of fascism in Europe, and rightly so. The government, those very far to the right, were scared, and the argument can be made they were very worried about national security, etc. And rightly so. It was horrible times. However, there's usually some disingenuous arguments somewhere if you dig deep enough, and that's for everybody. And so it was used as a cultural wedge, as it usually is against working people. But some of these programs were wildly popular, And so the first committees were formed saying that not only was it a waste of taxpayer money, it was a hotbed of radical ideas and anti-American behavior. Causing dissent, because you got to remember, a lot of the essays being first person didn't always, it wasn't, a Norman Rockwell painting. It was reflective of where it was in coal country, in Jim Crow South, again, that we spoke of earlier. Idaho is probably the best one. If you want to find one for reference, you could read it cover to cover like a novel. It's amazing. But they weren't this self-congratulatory, covering each other, in glory sort of a thing. It was an accurate reflection of where we were in the mid-30s in the United States of America into the late 30s and early 40s. And then subsequently, the programs were cut for those reasons. And there was a lot of red baiting. And in fact, I would argue that the success of those first committees in killing these programs led to the rise in McCarthyism, because it worked. It was successful. You had hearings, and Congress called on people. It was crazy, right? So, we're still reverberating with that history right now. And you can draw a line straight through. Like I said, I've already named off all the writers. So think about the coming of era and the coming of age at those moments. There's a direct straight line between this cultural awakening, especially among the working class and not the educated elite class, and the access to creativity and those creative works, to me, is a straight line to the beats, which, also embrace, literary journalism and these first person stories and living these wonderful, crazy, ludicrous lives. That it's definitely an era that I romanticize, at least literary works. Great time. So this is a good time for me to on camera take a drink of coffee. Woo! All jacked up on that good stuff. So that, in a very, very brief nutshell, is a little bit about the Federal Writers Program, which is a fantastic, like I say, a great example of what can be done. We forget that all work is work and all work are labors, unless you're running the show and you're not. So, teachers are laborers, writers are labor. I mean, anything that your labor is being used to make a profit, man, get in on it. I hate to Wu-Tang all this up and, tell you about some cream, but, those are the long and the short. So, yeah, I'm a reluctant. That's why I'm trying to play coy with you guys. You don't know. You're like, oh, man, he's doing all these socialist programs. But is he? That's cool. And you're not supposed to know, right? I don't know. We'll figure it out. However, so that's the end of what I wanted to go on to there. What I was going to say, which is fascinating, is the federal government is actually the publishers of this. They paid for all the publishing that went out, and some of them were wildly successful. And then eventually, by the end of it, again, the damage done politically was it was just kind of too great to overcome. So, but sorry for the abbreviated this week on the old podcast, and we're only going to talk about the New Deal one more time in one program. The last program will be the CCC, and hopefully we'll drop it a little bit deeper into that. And then we're going to move on to some other things, some more contemporary subjects, and be looking out. I'm probably going to go ahead and throw out a hello, kitty, little bit of a about me video at some point. That way, maybe you can decide whether this dude's kind of an idiot or completely uninteresting. You can move on, and we'll save each other a lot of time maybe. But for those that did enjoy the Strugglecast, go ahead, like, subscribe, download, tell your friends, share, help the algorithm do things. If you want to donate money, you want to do any of that, like I say, that is available. Take a look for it. It's much appreciated. And in the meantime, we'll see you next week on the Strugglecast. Y'all be good to each other. And if you can, talk to your neighbors, organize. Take care of everybody. Be good. Bye.